In this video, we're going to look at consumer and producer surplus. So let's say that you go to the mall and you are planning on spending $80 on a pair of shoes. Okay, you get to the mall and you have your $80 and you're ready to buy your shoes, and you take them up to the counter and you find out that those shoes are in fact only $50. Okay, consumer surplus is defined as the gains that consumers are able to experience from not having to pay as much as they would be willing to pay for goods and services, but instead being able to pay the market price. So let's say that you and many other people all were willing to pay $80 for these pair of shoes. Let's say 1,000 people were willing to pay $80 for this pair of shoes. However, they didn't have to pay $1,000. They were able to pay only $50. So that means that each person had $30 of consumer surplus. Okay? Each person that paid only $50 instead of $80 was able to save $30. Okay? So if we took that $30 and times it by the 1,000 people that are saving money, we'd see that consumer surplus grew by $30,000 just by those 1,000 people not having to pay as much as they would. Okay, there are obviously some people that would be willing to pay $60, $65, $70, $75, $90, maybe all the way up to $100 for this pair of shoes. Obviously, if the shoe was priced at $100, there would be significantly smaller quantity demanded than 2,000 units. But at equilibrium, there are going to be 2,000 people that are buying this good or service, okay, or this pair of shoes. All right, so let's go ahead and look at it from the producer side. If the producer is selling this good or service for $50, well, we know to make a pair of shoes, they are most likely made overseas and they do not cost $50 to produce. So maybe some producers would be willing to sell this pair of shoes for anything above $25, okay? At $25 a pair, they don't have to sell them for $25 a pair, but let's say that 1,000 pairs of shoes would be sold if they were $25 a pair. Okay, that means that producers don't have to sell them at $25; they get to sell them at $50 a pair. That means that we are able to see producers gaining from markets being in equilibrium instead of being the lowest price that they would be willing to sell for. Okay, so let's clean this graph up and let's look at producer surplus and consumer surplus individually. Okay, so anything above the equilibrium, all the way up along the demand curve to the intersection of price and demand, that entire triangle is going to be what we call consumer surplus. And this triangle down here at the bottom is going to be producer surplus. So basically it goes from the equilibrium all the way down to the supply curve, or it goes from the equilibrium all the way down to the demand curve. And, you know, it would probably help if I had labeled supply and demand. I don't know where those labels went. So obviously that's our supply curve and that's our demand curve. So now let's look at these triangles individually. So this up here is consumer surplus, and this down here being producer surplus. We can use the area of a triangle and very easily figure out what the total market surplus is. So consumer surplus would be 1/2 base times height. If this is the height, then we could assume that this would be the base. The base is 2,000 for both of them, and the height is is $50 for both producer and consumer surplus. I did it this way so that the numbers would be very easy. So we could figure out that the total market surplus, if we simply add these two things together, the total market surplus is obviously $100,000. Okay, that's how much consumers and producers are able to gain from markets being in equilibrium. Now let's look and see what happens when markets aren't in equilibrium. What happens if maybe the government comes in and says, hey, these shoes are competing with domestic shoes, and we are going to put a quota on the amount of these shoes that can be sold in the United States. We're not going to allow 2,000 of these shoes to be sold, but we'll put it back over here at 1,000. So the United States government is putting in a quota. Okay, so we're going to call this supply subquota. Okay, so now what's happened with the market? Well, we see that supply, this is the new supply curve at 1,000 units, and supply is intersecting with demand. So this is a new equilibrium price. It's certainly not what our old equilibrium price was going to be. It's going to be more, and we'll say that it is, let's say, $75. $75. So those of you that were willing to pay $80 are still getting a $5 surplus, but a lot of people are going to be edged out of the market now. They don't want the shoes if they're not $50 at $75. They're going to be too expensive. So now let's see, where is our consumer surplus? So as before, consumer surplus is the little green triangle. Well, it was the big green triangle. Now it's the little green triangle. This little area up here is all that remains of consumer surplus. So the new consumer surplus is this upper triangle right here, and it's going to be 1/2 base of 1,000 people times the price of $25. Okay, so that means that the new consumer surplus is going to be $12,500. And what's going on with the producer surplus? Well, to find out the producer surplus, it looks like we're going to have to draw in one additional curve. So let's say that this curve right here, we had it up there before, is $25. Okay, so that means that what's left of producer surplus? Well, producer surplus has this rectangle right here and this triangle down here left of their original producer surplus. Additionally, this area up here that used to be consumer surplus is now producer surplus. Okay, so that whole area is now producer surplus. So this is the new producer surplus. So the new producer surplus is this little triangle down here, which we can easily figure out is 1/2 base 1,000 units times the price of $25. And the only reason that we know that it's $25, I'm giving that to you. You wouldn't be able to figure this out as easily if you didn't have that in there. So the new producer surplus is this little triangle plus this rectangle right here with a base of, it's not a triangle, so we don't need to take half. So it's the base of $50 and the height of 1,000 units. Okay, so obviously our total market surplus is going to be, our producer surplus is going to be 12,500 plus, what was it, 62, plus 50,000 is going to give us 62,500. Okay, that is just for the producer surplus. So if we combine the producer surplus, the new producer surplus, with the new consumer surplus, if we add these two things together, we will see that the total market surplus is going to be, $75,000. Okay, originally it was $100,000, and now we're down to $75,000. Where did that $25,000 go? Well, it went to what we call deadweight loss. This triangle over here no longer exists. The market no longer gets to this triangle. So we're going to, let me do this really fast so that you can see it a little bit better. We're going to call this area right here our deadweight loss. Okay, that triangle right there is deadweight loss. That means that it is lost to society. It's no longer available for consumers or producers. So producers were actually made better off in this instance because the price went up so greatly. But the society as a whole does not have this cross-thatched area anymore. Okay, so this area right here is the dead weight loss. And we can see that the dead weight loss is 1/2 the base from 25 to 75, so $50, times the height of 1,000 to 2,000, so that's 1,000 units. So we see that the dead weight loss is equal to $25,000. Okay, so if we look at the dead weight loss and we subtract that from the total market surplus, we are able to see what's remaining in consumer and producer surplus. Okay, this also holds when we see the government put in a price floor or a price ceiling.